So how do you make it happen? I like to look at the ecosystem as a pie, and there are several components of that pie. So at the centre of our ecosystem pie is carbon. We have ecosystem services that are freebies offered by our ecosystem to us, and a lot of what David's been talking about, the benefits that we get from microbes, are ecosystem services. And then we've got these big spokes on the wheel. We've got soil health, biodiversity, water cycle and energy flow, which drive the whole system. Now, everything in that pie is interlinked. There is nothing there. You can't change one and not change all the rest. They all change together. But the thing that we can measure that indicates ecological health is actually carbon. And I think down the track, and I've spoken to people in USDA as well, is that we think that eventually you won't be selling carbon credits, you'll be selling eco-credits because of all the co-benefits. So here we're measuring carbon and you're selling carbon credits, but you're actually doing all of this other stuff as well as you add carbon to an ecosystem. And the proxy for measuring eco-credits will actually be carbon. But, and they've tried to set up a system in USDA already to sell eco-credits. So that thinking is around, and I know there's been a bit of sympathy for that in Canberra as well. If we don't manage that ecosystem well, we shrink every part of that pie, and we end up with a sick ecosystem. We have lower productivity. It means we've got to put more inputs in, and one of those is nitrogen. So if you're in a cropping system, I showed you the difference between having a healthy soil with plenty of carbon in it and one with no carbon in it, just in the nitrogen inputs alone. So as we've been mining Australia for the last couple of hundred years, this is what we've been doing. We've been shrinking this ecosystem down and down and down. And it means that really if we've shrunk it through poor management, we can very easily reverse it with good management. And that's going to be the key to changing things. And management, if we look at the changes that you can make as basically a pyramid, on the base of that pyramid is management. That's grazing management, cropping management, soil management. You're the person that's going to determine whether carbon's sequestered or not. It's how you manage your systems. The next level up is the one that David's been talking about, and that's biology. And I'm going to come back and talk about some of the management practices that you can do. So we've just spent a fair bit of time talking about biology, which is probably the next layer up and the first thing that you'd want to play with. The next level up from that is what I call catalytic inputs. So we've got most of Queensland and a lot of New South Wales soils, for example, are boron deficient. And boron is a driver of photosynthesis. It's involved in the transport and the production of sugar within the plant, and so is sulphur. So if we're short of those nutrients, we're actually just restricting what the plant can do to feed the microorganisms. So we're looking at nutrients here that are very small inputs that can make a big difference to your ecosystem, and boron is one of those. Boron, sulphur are probably two of the biggest ones. So we're looking at how do we get those out to stimulate the production of the plant to produce more sugar, which helps more bugs get going. And we've also talked a little bit about legumes. So I think that's really, these are the three, everything's got to be managed. There's biology, it's do we need additional nutrients, and what can we do with legumes that are the way in which we can start transforming our ecosystems. And I don't think it's one thing. I think that there's going to be combinations. If you had everything right, if you stacked all of those things together in that triangle or that pyramid, you're actually going to do a hell of a lot better than if you just stick one layer into it. And I think we've got a lot to learn about this. So in terms of management, obviously, we've got to manage livestock. If we've got livestock, they're not going to manage grass. We've got to do it for them. If you're in a cropping system, there's things like green manuring and cover cropping that you can look at. And the new approach to that is the multi-species cover cropping that Gabe Brown and some of the guys in the States have been doing. And there's quite a few people in Australia adopting this now as well. It's a great way to, again, to make a big impact on your soil biology and soil carbon in a very short period of time. Crop rotations, what you put into a rotation. The critical thing with cropping is to stop bare fallowing. The thing that prevents carbon build-up, and I know it's counterintuitive because most people do it because they think they're conserving moisture. The thing that conserves moisture most in your soil is carbon. So, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some stuff that's happening in West Australia around that. Bringing livestock into cropping systems, I think, is critical. Livestock add to our ability to improve soil health. We've continuous cropping, in other words, keeping crops growing, which is what David's been doing in his system. Don't bare fallow country, just put something else in there, and it can be weeds, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's photosynthesizing. And aeration is another one. Probably the most important nutrient we can put into a soil is air. And a lot of our soils are compacted, there has no air in them. If you go back to the basic requirements of all living things, shelter, food, water and air or oxygen. And if we don't have oxygen in our soil, you can put as much biology on it as you like and it's not going to thrive. So we've got to get these things in balance and make sure that everything's working. And in terms of biology, we could use either compost or compost extracts. Now, many people have tried, and I know there's people in the room that have tried compost teas. Now, compost extract is a very different product and a very different thing to a compost tea. What we're wanting to do with a compost extract is get that biology and get the organic acids and organic compounds that are the critical part of that compost and spread that out over a bigger area. So with compost extracts, for example, the general recommendation is you can take a ton of good quality compost and turn that into at least 30,000 litres of compost extract. The guys in West Australia are turning a tonne of compost into 70,000 litres of compost extract with their direct injecting. So when you direct inject, you can actually use a less concentrated brew. Now that, basically to do that, you put some compost into a little unit which forces a given amount of water through a given amount of compost under pressure, and out the bottom comes your compost extract and you go and spray that on your paddocks. So the application rate onto a pasture system as a foliar application when your grass is growing is between 50 and 100 litres of compost extract per hectare. So that means that 1 tonne of compost will go over somewhere between 300 and 600 hectares. So that makes the thing a fairly cheap application. And it hasn't got to be put on really accurately. If you just get out there and spray it, particularly in a grazing system, where you've got plenty of hooves and animals that can start eventually help spread those bugs, then as long as you get it out and get it going, I think over time the population will expand over your whole paddock. Fertiliser, just the catalysts, I think some of those things that are really critical to sugar production and plant production and photosynthesis, those types of nutrients, again used in small quantities as a foliar application, and it can all be put on at the same time in the same 100 litres of water. And I suspect that in some country putting all of those 3 things together, or those 4 or 5 things together, compost extract, fish emulsion, molasses, bit of boron, bit of sulphur, and maybe some calcium in some areas. Put those together and throw it all out in 100 litres of water per hectare. I think we've got to prove this up yet, and I'll talk a little bit about how we go about that. And then perennial legumes. So I've talked a bit about the perennial legumes, so I'll talk a little bit more about it. So in terms of management, obviously, there's a difference between those two properties, and the difference is management. And it's a choice the guy on the left's made relative to the guy on the right. A different neighbour, same comparison, and another neighbour, same comparison. So that management of whatever it is we do, whether it's in cropping or whether it's in grazing, unless it's managed, that's your foundation. Forget it. You're not going to be sequestering carbon, and you're not going to be changing your system. So that's your foundation of this. And these, a couple of shots come from a property in West Australia. And I think this is a barley plant, but you'll see it's just germinated. Look at the size of the shoot, but look at what's below that shoot. Now these guys use 1 tonne of compost, converted to 70,000 litres, and they use 10 litres per hectare of extract direct inject with planting. I'm pretty sure they put the food in as well, the molasses and the fish emulsion, and they also use a little bit of worm extract at the same time at 5 litres per hectare. This is West Australian loam, which is like beach sand with salt in it, and that's 11-inch rainfall country. And they've been able to grow crops on 5 inches of rain when everyone's crop around them has failed. In that system, in that soil, by using that injection, they are sequestering about between 2 and 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare. There's a couple of other things they do. They've brought livestock into the system. They do not bear fallow. Whatever grows over summer there, they graze with sheep. They're making money out of the sheep, and they have, since they've been doing this, they have never had a year where they haven't made a profit. So it...
No other inputs there?
No, they have used no fungicides and no insecticides. They will use occasionally a small dose of Roundup at establishment. So if their summer production is still going and it's going to interfere with germination, they use Roundup at about 1/3 of the normal recommendations. But the interesting thing is that they've had their crops analysed, and there is no chemical residue in their crop. That they're actually now being offered a premium for their product because it has it's several things. A, it has absolutely no residue in it, but B, the chemistry of that grain is really, really good quality, and it's also about 12% protein is what they're getting out of it. So they're getting a premium product with lower inputs and less risk on what I would call shit sand in about 11-inch rainfall. So it can be done, and it is being done, you know, with very, very low inputs and very low cost. We talked about Progatis earlier on, and that's what it looks like. It's like a second cousin of Leukina. And we've got a little bit of data on Leukina as well. So basically the difference between cell-grazed grass and in the Leukina rows, about 1.78 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. And in the inter-row, where in the grass, it's about 3 tonnes per hectare per year increase in carbon sequestration. So that's over a longer period of time, but it's showing a similar trend in terms of what the legume is doing to the grass, and that's adding a bit of nitrogen, which is increasing the carbon in the system. One of the other things we can do is aeration. I mentioned that getting air into the soil is also critical. This is a guy this year in New South Wales who got a yeoman's out, and I was there, I think it was about March, and we looked at his soils, and he had a hard pan about that far down. He had another hard pan just below that, about there, and he had another one down about there. And the plant community was really sick, and obviously there's not much air getting into the soil. So instead of trying to treat all of those things at once, I said to him, let's just go in at about that depth and take out those first 2 pans. So that's what he did. And he missed this strip through here, that green strip. Now that green strip is all saffron thistle. Everything outside here is what he sowed. It was a multi-species planting. And he'd taken 2,000 DSE days of grazing off this in 6 months since he put it in. That's about, for those of you who work in SDHs, it's about 300 SDHs. So pretty high carrying country now that's happened. But if you see what Mother Nature did, so out here, he went out and broke up the pan and got a whole lot of stuff growing. Mother Nature decided she's going to do it as well, so she put thistles in there and started to break up those pans. But obviously that's going to give you a lot more productivity than waiting for that. So I'm not against using things to speed this process up. And air, so what's happened here is we've got air in. Now, including the cost of the seed and the cost of the cultivation, that was 100% return on the cost of actually doing that in 6 months. In other words, he got all that money back out of that grazing in that period and in 2,000 DDHs of yield. Firstly, there's 2 markets. I mentioned this earlier. There's a voluntary market and the mandated market. So the mandated market, or the voluntary market, basically is companies that buy carbon credits for marketing reasons. So Qantas and Virgin and companies like that, so you can tick a box when you buy an airline ticket to say that you've bought the carbon credits to cover that flight. That's a voluntary market. They don't have to do that. So they go and buy cheap carbon credits. So the price of carbon credits in the voluntary market in Australia is around $6 a tonne CO2. The mandated market is the ERF at the moment. It was the carbon tax, now it's the emission reduction fund, and that'll morph into something else, despite what's been said around politics in the last 2 days. So that's the government-sponsored one. And the price there, the last auction was $11 or $12 was the average price in the last auction, and we scored another 1.1 million tonnes in that auction. That's running out of money, so it's got one more auction left in it. That's about it. One of your biggest risks in doing a carbon project was supply, so your supply side risk. So if you had agreed, you'd signed a contract to deliver 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, and you turned up and were only delivered 50,000 tonnes at the end of the day, under some contracts you would be liable to supply the missing 50,000 tonnes. Under the current soil carbon contracts that we can offer, you are not liable for the extra 50,000 tonnes. So we have an intermediary between us and the government, and that intermediary is Corporate Carbon, who is an aggregator. So they have the contract with the government, we have a contract with them, but they have the obligation to supply all the credits. We have the obligation to do the best we can to supply the credits. That passes through to you. So if you're missing 50,000 tonnes, you don't have to buy them somewhere else and make them up. The other one is risk of reversal was around there for up until a year or two ago, and now if you're in a country that's only going to ever be under pasture, there is no risk of somebody stopping a carbon project. So if you sell the place 10 years down the track and you've sold some carbon credits and you decide to get out of grazing and flog the place off, if the next guy coming in leaves it and he goes back to continuous grazing, pulls up all the fences, then that's fine. There's no obligation to make good the credits that were sold. The government deems that they're going to stay there. If that next guy comes in and ploughs the country up and puts a crop in, he is liable for the carbon credits that you've sold, that he destroys through ploughing. So that's going to be a commercial decision for that guy. What's the value of the carbon credits to be able to plough it up versus what am I going to get for the crops that I put in when I do plough it up? It's a commercial decision. But pasture to pasture is not a risk for either you or the next guy coming in. So there are some negatives in this that you need to be aware of. So the permanence period, well, that's probably not such a big one anymore. The carbon maintenance obligation now is relatively minor. Impact on land values, I think that's sort of starting to disappear now. Are there liabilities or assets associated with a carbon project? The market doesn't know the answer to that yet. The complexity is an issue. Delayed income is an issue, is a negativity about it. Positive implications, it can have an impact on cash flow, diversity, etc. So basically, in summary, carbon farming is in fact a reality. As I mentioned earlier, there's 190 odd million a year going back into rural Australia now in carbon projects. It has the potential to change your income, to change your cash flows. It will require a change of management.